Thank you so much for coming indoors on such an absolutely gorgeous afternoon. I want to thank the Center for Conflict Studies and the Post-Hierarchies project in specific and all the coordinating that Annika and Tarek and Liana have done to make this possible, and also the tech support. I'm just going to jump right in. And I'm going to present on my current book project that is currently under review. So these projects, they have these very long timelines, and this is a very beautiful opportunity for me to present now because I'm anticipating to receive the evaluations very soon. So I've taken a little break from it, and so now I get to sort of re-enter in what seems to be a convulsive and cruel historical moment. So much has changed even in the last year globally. So it's also kind of making me rethink my project, and that's something that I am going to do sort of spontaneously during this talk, is think about, well, how did I start this project and where am I now, and how do I want to re-enter it as I do my revisions. So this project comes out of pending debts that I felt that existed from my first book project that was also out of my dissertation. And here you have the English edition and the Spanish edition in front of you. And when I did this research, I was also doing activism with a group called LEAFs, the Lesbianas Independientes Socialistas Feministas, which is independent socialist feminist lesbian collective. And through that work and organizing with LGBTI and gender and sexual nonconforming people in Lima in particular, it became very clear that there was a lot of impact of the armed conflict in Peru and the authoritarian regime in Peru on populations that were never really considered, right? So this was a pending debt that I felt that I wanted to address. And so that started to be the beginnings of my project. And one of the things that I found very frustrating as I started this project that I wanted to respond to was the fact that in 2016 or so, 2017, there was this incredible sort of victorious celebration of this trajectory of transitional justice processes. Particularly, I'm looking at Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, framed as this narrative of like modernity and progression, of inclusion of these issues as being very important and celebratory, which I felt was significant. I mean, yes, the gains have been because of movement work, but the way it was being framed was that these nation states were kind of little by little somehow benevolently being inclusive. And so my initial sense was, there's another story here. The only reason why people are included that are non-normative is because of years of struggle. And so one of my big concerns was that the truth of how these issues became included be exposed, even though it's kind of considered informal, marginalized, it actually, what people are doing matters. And so this is a moment where, so much has changed over these years. We had the pandemic. Now, coming from the US, we have the rise of a, authoritarian regime, and we have a situation that's incredibly concerning, and it's completely shifted how I'm thinking about framing this project. So this is kind of where, I want to sort of think as I walk you through. So I'm going to sort of explain to you the initial questions and what I've done, but it kind of also have this additional reflection about this moment and how I'm reframing. So my main questions were, first, how and why are harms against people of non-normative genders and sexualities included or excluded from transitional justice efforts in each case? Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. So this is like the northern Andean region, right? How and why are they included and excluded from these efforts to deal with gross human rights violations under authoritarian regimes or armed conflict or generalized political violence and political repression? And then the second question, which became much more sort of juicy and exciting for me as I moved through this project, was what strategies do activists use in the ongoing struggle for the recognition of their humanity through truth, justice, and reparations? So that second question has become much more of the heart of this project for me. And I'm situated, my degree is in politics. I'm situated in an interdisciplinary position, but I'm also trying to, very purposely make an intervention in transitional justice and in gender and sexual politics and in the way we think about the formation of movements and political change and governance more broadly. So along the lines of this sort of more intersectional approach, I was blending, or I have blended, both sort of a regional, Andean regional approach and also sort of the comparative political science approach. So the Andean regional approach unites these three cases, and I talk a little bit about Chile, but 4 cases is just too much. So I really focused on Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. And in the Andean regional, I see this as like a unification of sort of a shared geography, ancestral cosmology, and colonial legacy as the unification elements of the region, the Andean region, and also the fact that there's very, very deep and strong activist networks of exchange and solidarity over decades in the Andes among people of non-normative genders and sexualities. So the regional part is this, and then I put it in sort of productive tension with the more comparative Andean approach that would look at, okay, let's look at these cases. What is the Peruvian case of transitional justice, right? What happened during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru? What happened in the Truth Commission in Ecuador, which almost no one knows about, but there was a Truth Commission in Ecuador. And of course, everyone knows about the case of Colombia with the integral system of truth, justice, and reparation and non-repetition, which is ongoing, although the Truth Commission has concluded, right? So thinking about these comparatively, and again, sort of how they build off each other, right? Because you can see there's also a chronological temporal movement here. Like lessons learned from Peru have been taken up in Colombia, and the Ecuador case is sort of its own beast, but it also has some very interesting pieces that need to be taken into consideration. So this is sort of to give you sort of a interdisciplinary theoretical frame. And then I'll move a little bit to the research design. I definitely focus on qualitative approaches, which include interviews, textual and visual analyses, collection of in-country primary and secondary resources, and participant observation in public events and movement-based activities. And here there's an important mark where one thing is that I have a child. So the fact that I have a child and I'm parenting has completely changed the way in which I can research in comparison to before I had a child, right? So before I had a child, I could just, if I was lucky enough to get funding, I could go and be in Peru for months on end and attend to my research project. Now that I have a child, I could only do trips of 2 to 3 weeks. And as much as I could, I brought my child with me. And there's a whole different negotiation of how you do research. And so, being very transparent about these trips were what I could do during this chapter of my life. But also it built off of all of these, years, if not decades, of building, trusting relationships with people in Peru and reaching those networks into Colombia and Ecuador also, because people who do this kind of human rights work, people who work on transitional justice, people who work on gender and sexual politics, pretty much all know each other. So the connections were very, very rich so that I could actually do the work, even in these shorter periods, with a comprehension of that, although I may not be there long periods, my personal and political commitments are evident on this because of my trajectory. So that's what facilitated that more intensive period. Then, of course, we all got hit with the pandemic. And so virtual interviews and archival research as much as possible, and then more recently going back into doing in-country research. So these are components that I think are important to be very transparent about, and that many times in academia are not discussed. And they're also, I mean, as you may understand, I identify as a scholar activist, and like I consider my work in scholarship and in the academia space as a platform to be able to leverage for the projects that are happening that I'm committed to in solidarity, right? So this is important. And that would lead naturally to the way I kind of approach doing research, which I call activist interpretive protagonism. It's very sort of academic jargony phrasing, but it works somewhat for me. Thinking about shifting the locus of interpretive power towards the activists and their embodied knowledge, because of course we know in sort of political science and international relations, the studies are more about institutions and about like elite actors and maybe discourse analysis and quantitative analysis, which sort of depersonalizes the kinds of issues that I want to look at. Data analysis, right, which has its important roles, but what I wanted to get at was what are the struggles from the collective marginalized communities up? Like how are people talking about what they would like to see? So I write here 4 main sort of political commitments that I have about solidarity, about following the lead of activists, not imposing, especially global north frameworks, but really listening for what matters, right? And like seeing over and over again, what is the saturation point around certain sort of configurations of thought or trajectories of narratives that seem to be very, very relevant. And then also, what are the critiques of them? Because there's not really, obviously, any capital T truth with all these things. And recuperating embodied collective memory and centering body politics in the register of transgressive practices. So I'm going to do a teeny bit of diving in here to a couple paragraphs from my intro to give a little bit more here in terms of who I foundationally draw from. I really am very inspired by the work of Diego Falconi, who's an Ecuadorian literary scholar and an attorney who's based out of Barcelona. And he wrote a book in 2016 called De las cenizas al texto, literaturas andinas de las disidencias sexuales en el siglo XX. So from ashes to the text, Andean literature of sexual dissidents in the 20th century. And again, very interdisciplinary. I mean, he's writing from literature, but he's also, an interdisciplinary person trained in law. So Falconi explores the figure of the sodomite and how the colonial gaze linked it to indigeneity to create a foundational other that naturalized and justified colonial conquest. The punishment for the indigenous sodomites' moral rupture and sin was burning, and only the ash remained as the mark of absence. In regional literature, the indigenous sodomites' ever-present absence in the form of the ash, metaphorically, right, resists oblivion and marks the discontinuities in the past and the present. Falconi reincorporates this defeated sexual dissidence, the dirty remnant that defies erasure, as central to the notion of what is Andean, through a methodology of tracing the ash, looking for that dirty remnant, the remnant of the colonial effort to exterminate the indigenous sodomite. Falconi registers transgressive subjects and practices to settle the debt of the absence. So I really was taken by Falconi's methodology of tracing the ash. what is that dirty remnant of dissident genders and sexualities historically that has resisted erasure, that stays in there, that may be something you would never notice and you would discredit because it seems like a dirty stain or a messy spot, but is indeed the remnant of the colonial effort to erase the indigenous sodomite, which is the defeated Andean sexuality. So recovering that as part of a narrative of the Andes. And so out of this metaphor, I really ground my effort to think about what are we not paying attention to, right? What, if I think about, if I engage with collectives of activists and their work to build embodied memory, what comes forth? How can I bring that forth in this project so that then we recover a more full reparative understanding? And so what came forth was a series of different kinds of dissident resistance practices. And I highlight 3. And these were all present in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia in different ways. So I'm also going to want to go into a little bit here. Actually, maybe I'll... The way that these function in all of these cases is that through artivist work, or the political activism through artistic expression, through both oral and written testimony, through the construction and curation of spaces of denunciation, so like public tribunals, public spaces curated for holding testimony around types of violence or harms to people who are non-normative in terms of gender and sexuality, that all of these practices, they have an effect, which is a detonation, an explosion of the silence, a resistance and a shattering of the complicity of impunity. So this is the piece that I felt was so powerful that I wanted to really focus on. And what I found, what I would like to do for this talk is really focus in on artivism. So, you know, I could do a lot more about all of these 3, but I'm going to focus on artivism. And I would say all of these 3, you know, the detonation of silence and impunity comes through a number of things, a number of practices, claiming and making visible the presence of subaltern subjects, taking up public space, right? Being collectively in a space, claiming existence, also inserting the body and collective subjectivities into spaces of erasure and silence, documenting harms. If I have time, I'll give you 2 examples, and the documenting harms is particularly relevant for the example from Peru. Again, you know, all of these are super interconnected, offering affirmative expressions of collective personhood, presenting alternative visual representations, which is particularly relevant for the example from Colombia, intervening in the public sphere and political discourse, forcing a collective acknowledgement through the creation of other words to name things that are happening that haven't been named. And one example I won't be able to get into is naming of dehomosexualization clinics in Ecuador. Naming them dehomosexualization clinics before they weren't named. So that has become the popular discourse. So forcing terminology into the public sphere is very powerful, right? negotiating the limits of what can be comprehended through the resistance practices that do that detonation, right? Explode the silences, and expressing the possibilities held within collective radical imagination. So all of these pieces, I would say, circulate as what happens through dissident resistant practices, but I will focus now on artivism. So let's get into the first of two examples. The first example comes from Colombia. And we know that we're all very aware that there's this sort of global precedent-setting transitional justice efforts in Colombia. We're all aware that there was a peace treaty signed and that there's all these different incredible efforts happening. Well, that's only one of more than 10 previous failed efforts, right? We have to remember that the process to get there has been filled with failure. And you could even say we're post-accord but not post-conflict in Colombia too, right? So this is very messy. But what I want to do is I want to rewind to one of the previous failed peace discussions, which was with the Colombian President Andrés Pastrana's Caguán peace talks at 1999 through 2002 with the FARC. Now, during that time, there continues to be a nonprofit organization called Planeta Paz. And what Planeta Paz did in that period was really, really phenomenal in that it facilitated a civil society agenda building peace process from civil society. So it invited representatives from many different sectors. And so it's an intersectoral effort to create a collective peace agenda from the bottom up. And what happened was the director, who I had a very interesting conversation with a couple years ago, he said, you know, my sister's a lesbian. And I kind of realized that there was something missing here. And I was like, yeah, how about that? Yeah, okay, so you became sensitized to, you know, maybe that there are people who are not, you know, heteronormative in their lives, and that they're not represented in this effort. So he began to ask around, like, who could be part of maybe the construction of a beginning of a national articulation of an LGBT populational sector that could be represented in this process. So, you know, he made that effort and brought together a number of people who identify within, you know, if you think about sort of like hierarchies, mostly gay, some lesbian, maybe one or two bisexual and transgender people into this space. And that was the first sort of moment of national articulation of some sort of agenda within the peace process. So I think that, you know, there's several people who write about this, for example, Fidelma Ash and Fernando Serrano, that peace processes are spaces in which there's an opportunity to articulate erased or non-normative populational sectors and be named and be recognized and claim rights. So this is sort of a very interesting example of this. And within that process, what happened was they thought about, well, who are we and what would be our claim? What would be our motto? What would be how we explain what we want, right? And what they came up with was the idea that the body is the first territory of peace. And they came up with this in their discussions. There's many different conflicting narratives about how this came up. But one of the ones that I thought was very powerful is that the body is the site of conflict in multiple spaces, in the space of the family, the body, and the body expression and desire and identity is a space of conflict in school, in religious institutions, of course in the armed conflict. But it's the body that has been displaced. So how do we understand peace? First and foremost, it's by re-territorializing our bodies. And I thought that that was an extremely powerful articulation that, of course, 25 years back, it was a different moment. Now there's incredible discussions about bodies and land and peace and territory and deterritorialization and re-territorialization. But this is sort of a very sort of initial articulation that I feel that I want to recover and put forth, right? And the group that was formerly known as Mujeres al Borde, that are now called Al Borde Transfeminista, two people, Clau Corredor and Ana Lucia Ramirez, were part of this initial sector building, and they created a 2-minute audiovisual piece that they presented in several spaces that were about sort of this Planeta Paz, sort of peace, kind of fair public interventions, and it was put on a loop, and it was shown, and it's these very tight shots of just bodies, and bodies that are entangled, bodies that are not necessarily always decipherable, like whose body is who, and there's such tight shots that there's no context. So it speaks also to the fact that people of non-normative genders and sexualities have always already been displaced. Like there's not really a place to be. So the tight shots sort of really refocus on the re-territorialization of the body. And I have a few images that help. It's just black and white. There's only audio in terms of sound as music. There's no like words, and there's a lot of sort of overlaps and shadows. That is also very, it gets read as I have a few quotes from the writings of Corredor and Ramirez about the production of this video. And they write, this is an aesthetic proposal that defines respect for the body, sexualities, and the affective expressions as the path towards peace. So all of the images are of embraces, of sort of these very intimate, nude or semi-nude images that very quickly became censored, right? So the next quote, the bodies of LGBT people are seen through the optic of perversion, pornography, prostitution, and promiscuity, simply because we have opened and structured our personal and interpersonal relations through nonviolent and alternative communication based on the use of the senses, which have allowed us to play and recreate gender roles and aesthetics. So yes, this video was immediately censored. It was taken off, any platforms. It was not allowed, So it's something that hasn't been able to circulate, and it was only because of building relationships with these people that they gave me permission to like have a copy of the film or the little short that I'm happy to share if it seems appropriate, but that allows us to kind of understand how this erasure is so complete, how much there's this, like when we talk about the ash, the remnants of ash, how is it that these transgressive projects and possibilities immediately get banned and shut down? And how is this a possibility of recuperating that ash, right, of the Andean sexual dissidents? Lastly, they write, it has been disseminated in diverse peace-building spaces with the intention of sensibilization toward and visibility of diversity of sexual and gender options, reivindicating the respect toward the body and the free exercise of sexuality. So I really love this, and I cite Clau Corredor and Ana Lucia Ramirez as knowledge producers, not as a place to gather data from. And I work alongside with them to uplift this key argument, right? That the centrality of the body in LGBTIQ plus reparative justice needs to always be highlighted, and that we need to invert that epistemic order and transitional justice that traditionally centers the nation state as the locus of building peace. So what they're arguing is that it's the body that we must attend to, in which if we can re-territorialize and honor the body, we have a much better opportunity towards peace. So I don't claim it as my own knowledge. I claim it as something that's an incredibly valuable contribution from artivists in Colombia, and that I work with and uplift. Okay, I do have time for the second example. So the second example, maybe I'll do a teeny review here. Remembering this. So that it clearly, that first example, it hits almost all of these things, right? It is about making visible the presence of subaltern subjects. It's inserting the body and the subjectivity into the void of erasure. They don't document harms. That is not what they're doing. They're doing sort of like a collective world-making exercise of what the world they want to live in. Like even the production of the video itself, the intimacy of being naked collectively and videoing these positions is an incredibly trust-building activity, right? I don't know how many of us have created videos with semi-nude or nude physical presence, but that's definitely not something that you just do with any random person, right? So thinking about how the process by which they created this is also about creating the world in which the re-territorialization of the body is a celebration of collective humanity, right? And I won't go through all of them, but I kind of just want to regroup on this. And then as I move into the Peru example, there's more on the documentation of harms, like that third point. All right, so the second example comes out of my work. Remember in the very beginning I said I had these pending debts after I wrote the book about Peru and decolonizing transitional justice in Peru. So this is like an image of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the way in which they ran their public hearings, and then the final, multi-volume documents of the final report being sort of celebrated with the then President Toledo. So there's this moment, right, in 2003 of the finalization of this project, which started in 2001. And in all of those, I think, 9 volumes of the final report out of the research that they did in Peru, there was a page and a half about harms against gender and sexual minorities. And I wondered, that is interesting. And with the sort of activism I had been doing, besides the research I did for my book, I had come to understand the backstory. And so I thought to myself, I want to put this in my book, but your book can't be everything. So that was like a very big pending debt for me. It's like, I want to go much more deeper into that. So the story behind that is an artivist collective project. And that to me was incredible. Like to have an example, as I'll sort of give you the tagline and then I'll build it out, that through a collective artivist project, the issue came to the fore and was added at the very last minute to the final report. So like, usually there aren't such direct causal lines that you can sort of say, look, this does matter. But this is an example of like, yes, look, this really does matter. Okay, so what happened here is that there's a group called the Movimiento Homosexual de Lima, which is the homosexual movement of Lima, that was established in 1982, which, if you think about the Peruvian conflict, it was established right at the beginning of the Peruvian conflict in Lima. And that movement had several people who were especially in the leadership, who were very interested in documenting what was happening to other gay people, or at that point you would use the word travesti, in Peru. So there was an internal movement effort to document like what is happening, what is going on here, right? So there was some, trips that several people took to different regions. And one of the sort of, what would you call it, more significant documented cases was the case of a massacre in Tarapoto in the northern Amazon that the Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru, or the Revolutionary Tupac Amaru movement, documented in their weekly publication called El Cambio as a part of their social cleansing campaigns. So here, this is the documentation out of it, and it says, among the delinquents that were executed by the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, there were drug addicts, homosexuals, and soplones, which would be like traitors, who cynically promoted the armed forces. So it's like, this is part of the sort of social cleansing efforts of the armed group, right? And the case of a massacre in a gay bar was a significant sort of piece of this social cleansing. And in the documentation process that MOL did, the Movimiento Homosexual de Lima, they documented that and a number of other cases, and they created what we might be called a memory box, or in the Andes, a retablo. But they made a gigantic one, like with doors that size, a gigantic one in which the collective, among a collective group of activists who were artists, who were also historians, who were previously in religious orders, a whole group of people, and were able to create this, painting the outside in sort of the typical Andean images of like flowers and like as a nice little kind of beautiful depiction, and then opened to the documentation of these harms and who was killed and under what circumstances. And here, this is a picture of a picture. So you see, like, a friend of mine had found in their, dusty box a picture or two, and they took a picture and they sent it to me through WhatsApp, and this is like the precarious remains of that sort of remnants of the ash, right? Like, where is that documentation, right? And so you see some of the activists here, and you see the retablo with the documentation in it, and this was placed, here's another image too, with candles. This was placed in a public mobilization in 2003, and one of the commissioners of the Truth Commission and several of the employees happened to be at that mobilization, and they viewed this retablo, and they said, we're writing and finishing the editing of the report, and we don't have anything on any of this. Please give us your documentation immediately. And so they gave them the documentation, and then they cross-referenced it against the database of the commission, and they found 4 crosses that were, what would you call it, like verified. And that became that page-and-a-half content that was placed at the very last moment into the report. So, clearly, if there hadn't been this public artivist collective construction and intervention into, the public sphere, this would have never even ended up as a page-and-a-half. So I think like this is a very interesting kind of moment, right? And then, kind of poignantly, they had borrowed these enormous doors from the university, one of the universities in Peru that one of them worked at, that were part of like some sort of other exhibit. And then the administrator said, you need to bring those back. We need them back. So they had to disarm their whole artistic endeavor, repaint the doors, and return the doors. And that was it. No more retablo. But then the next year, what they created was what my art historians call a transmediation of the effort into what's called the quipu de la memoria. So the quipu is an ancestral Andean tradition of record keeping. And so they borrowed the idea of the quipu as a way to create a memory collectively of harms against gender and sexually diverse people. And they marked the date, the 31st of May, as the date to recognize the struggle against crimes, hate crimes. And that is the date of the massacre that took place in the northern Amazon region in 1989 by Tupac Amaru. So and that has become a date of, national date of memorialization. And on that date, they have, they take the quipu in a vigil through the streets of Lima. So this has become actually an ongoing collective memory project that has shifted its material expression, but it has always been a collective artivist project. And then this case is actually being, it's under investigation by one of the public attorney, what do you call it? Fiscalia, public defender? No. Prosecutor, public prosecutor. It's under investigation by the public prosecutors now. And of course, that is a trajectory of 25 years or so. Like, all of these bits add up, right? So to start closing, I gave you two examples that I develop with regard to artivism in this book. And I take, in analyzing these materials, of course, there's testimony that I could discuss in the spaces of denunciation. I use an approach that I consider to be called porous, a porous approach, which I draw from the work of Macarena Gomez Baris in her book, Extractive Zone. I really like her work because she also promotes this idea of sort of messiness and allowing for the way in which these types of efforts are interwoven and inseparable. And that sort of aligns with my regional approach, thinking about the interwoven solidarities and exchanges across movement collectives in the Andean region, and how fluid and unsettled movement-based dynamics always are. There's not a settledness ever. There's always this sort of ongoing movement and change that needs to be accounted for. And in our current historical moment now, we're looking at a very different moment than when I started this project. We're looking at, this increasing criminalization and pathologization of people of non-normative genders and sexualities, and a general authoritarian turn. In Peru, for example, they just passed a law to basically ban non-governmental organizations. And so there's so many struggles, ongoing struggles, that if the non-governmental organizations that have been behind the litigation processes for these ongoing struggles are no longer legal, then it is impossible to go forward with these justice projects in a formal sphere. So there's so many different layers of struggle currently that refigure this project of mine that I am now also trying to make sense of. And I'll close now just offering sort of a peek at what looks like the table of contents of this book so far. So I have a first section that is much more sort of a nod to the comparative political science folks, and it really looks at these cases, right? But the second section is what I focused on in this talk, particularly the fourth chapter on artivism. I focused on this talk in terms of the Peruvian and the Colombian gender and sexual dissident practices that detonate silence and impunity and insert alternative narratives that recover the dirty remnants of the colonial efforts to erase this dissident gender and sexual, always present but ignored element of the Andean region. So I'm going to close there, and we can move on.